Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and having beautiful dinnerware that can go from the oven to the table is very handy, but it would even be handier if we could actually handle it after it comes out of the oven. It's nice that it can go both ways, but when it comes from the oven, it's hot, and we can't put it on the table and serve with the same container. So we need to make a cover so that we can handle the container. So I will be using this little ceramic container, and it does go from the oven to the table. And I'm going to make a container that this is going to fit in with a handle so that I can bring it to the table, put it down, don't worry about where it goes, and still be able to pick it up and pass it around. This method, you're going to be able to make a cover for any container that you like. We're going to need that container and a piece of paper to start with, a pencil, and we're going to start with some measurements. The first thing we want to do is measure the bottom. Now I do have a little bit of curve, but I'm just going to square off the measurements. And I'm going to make those measurements go to the maximum size. I will be using 2 layers of batting plus 2 layers of cotton fabric. So having that little extra will be helpful. So I'm going to measure the bottom of my container. And rounding up, I have 8.5 inches by 5.5 inches. So I'm going to start and draw that on my paper. So the first drawing is at 8.5 inches by 5.5 inches. And I've extended those lines quite far out. I'm going to use those lines after as a guide. So my center space is at 8.5 inches by 5.5 inches. The next measurement is going to be the side. The side happens to be on an angle, so I'm going to measure it on an angle. I'm going to put that ruler right along the bottom and check that mark. If you do the ruler straight, the measurement will actually be smaller. So be sure to follow the angle of the pot. And in my case, it's almost 2.5 inches, so I will be using 2.5 inches. So I'm going to draw 2.5 inches all the way around my center measurement. That center measurement and my 2.5 inches around the outside. So I will have these 4 squares in the corner. These squares will eventually be trimmed off. This particular container does have this little handle, and I want my fabric to come up and around so that when I'm picking this container up, I'm going to be holding onto fabric. I won't try to have to just balance underneath. I want to be able to pick this up. So I'm going to need the measurement from underneath, around, and over. So from the bottom and around, I have 2 inches. So on each side of my diagram, I'm going to add an additional 2-inch mark. So this is the bottom, this is the side, and this is going to be a little handle that I can wrap over. I'm going to use the pot as a guide and make a mark. And that way I know how big that handle is. I can square this off and transfer it to the other side. In my case, that is 3 inches. I want to just round this off in this corner. So I have that bottom, the side, and the handle. I'm just going to round that off and do that round to both sides of the handle. This is the pattern that is going to match the pot. I have that bottom, my 4 sides, and that handle that is going to come over. These corners need to be cut off, and we can cut out this pattern. So this template or this pattern should fit your pot. Put your pot down and test it. We should have a little bit extra on the sides and enough room that when we pick this up, it's going to give us the little spot to pick it up with without burning ourselves. Once we're confident that this is going to fit, we're going to be able to cut out our pattern. This pattern or template is going to be used on top of 2 pieces of fabric. I've taken the fabric and I have just quilted a piece of batting on the one side, and I've quilted batting on the second side. So both pieces have batting quilted on them. This is 100% cotton fabric and that 80-20 batting. The more cotton we can do, the better. Pin your 2 pieces of fabric together so right sides are touching, and I have both the battings on the outside. I can now trace around this shape. Once this is traced, we're going to be able to sew some seams before we trim these layers apart. So our first stitching lines will be these curves, which will be the handles. We can close off one side. Then there's one side we want to leave open. And this is where we're going to be able to take everything and put it right side out. But we can do just a little bit of stitching here, and it's going to depend on the size of your container. We want to leave a big enough opening to pull everything out. So anywhere between 1 inch to 2 inches, we can stitch along this edge, still leaving that big opening. With those part seams sewn, we're going to be able to cut and give ourselves a seam allowance. And scissors work quite well. You don't need to measure, just trim off a seam allowance. So I have that drawn line, which is the stitching line, with my seam allowance. And I'm going to need 4 pieces of elastic and 4 buttons. What I'm looking for is a little loop of elastic that's going to fit around the button that I'm going to choose to close up the other side. So you're going to be able to gauge how much elastic you're going to need for your button size. The elastic size is 3 inches for me. Make a loop, and we're going to put these loops, so we have the loop side, up into these corners. I will have one on each of these corners, but they're going to be tucked inside. So make that loop and put that loop inside right along the top and pin that loop in place. Those elastics are going to be in the corner. When you pick this up, the elastic is going to end up putting these edges together. Do 1 more row of stitching, starting in this little edge, coming down, back stitch a little bit over top of that elastic, go all the way around your original stitching, back stitch in the corner, go around, back stitch, going all the way around until you get to this corner. So we're still going to have this open, but we're getting that second row of stitching just for security. Before we turn this right side out, we need to trim off the seams. We need to take the scissors and snip right into this point. So I've trimmed right to the point. Be careful not to stitch on the threads, just right as close as you can. And we can trim off a little bit in here. So there's just less bulk in that corner. These 4 outside edges now need to be trimmed. So we've just taken off that triangle on those 4 corners. One more piece of trimming, and this is optional, but I do find it lays nice and flat when this is turned right side out. We're going to grade the seams. Grading the seams means we're going to cut the top seam different than the bottom seam. So the top one is going to be a little bit shorter than the bottom one, so it'll look like a step. So we have the bottom seam and the top seam, 2 different seam allowances. And do this all the way around, except for this area that we have it opened, we're going to turn this right side out. Once those seams have been graded, we're going to be able to turn this right side out. And you're going to be able to see how smooth these edges are because of these seams being graded. And that extra row of stitching has given us some stability. We have our 4 loops, the handle, and the opening. Take time and push out all of your seams and press this flat. As we're pressing, take time and roll that seam inside. Once this is all pressed, we're going to be able to top stitch this closed and go all the way around with a row of top stitching. So there'll be no hand sewing required. With that row of top stitching done, it looks good from both sides. These edges are going to come up, so we will need to put buttons. But before we do that, I would recommend doing 1 row of stitching right along that bottom. So we will be stitching this edge here. With that center stitching done, it folds in the area that we want it to fold in, and it does keep a nice shape. From here, we can put buttons on, and it won't matter what side we put the button on. My cover is now done, and I can put it in reverse. It won't matter if the buttons are inside or outside. As long as these buttons can withstand some heat, you're going to be fine. Once my dinner is ready, I'm going to be able to put it in this container. With a little tug, this is going to fit in, and I now have the handles that are wrapping around. So I'm not trying to serve from the bottom. I can serve with the handles. If you don't like this tight, you just need to move the buttons to give yourself a little bit more room. So each container is going to be a little bit individual. Do you want it to sit underneath the container, or do you want it to sit up? Placement of these buttons will make all the difference on how tight or loose you want it to be. Once you've made one container, it'll give you a good idea on how you like them to fit. If you don't like them this tight, we just need to add a little bit of measurement on your original pattern. Add 1/4 inch all the way around your bottom measurement and add 1/4 inch around the outside. That's going to give you a lot more space so it's not so tight. So each container is going to have its own pattern or its own template, depending on the size of the container. This really is going to make it very handy to have that container go from the oven to the table. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.